Prince William has reportedly lost his composure after Camilla's daughter, Laura Lopes, publicly confronted Princess Anne in a moment that left the room stunned. What appeared to be a family dispute quickly became something far more serious when questions emerged about how Laura entered the event, why a photographer seemed ready to capture the confrontation, and what happened behind palace doors afterward. It raised questions about loyalty, influence, and whether someone had deliberately allowed a private grievance to become a public spectacle. But what really triggered William's fury, and why did the consequences reach far beyond Princess Anne? Stories like this rarely end where they begin, because to understand why William reacted so forcefully, we have to go back to the moment the palace first realized that Laura's confrontation may not have been as spontaneous as it appeared. Anne had been carrying out what should have been a routine royal engagement, moving through the event with the same disciplined composure that has defined her public life for decades. She was focused on the people, the displays, and the schedule in front of her. William's response was not simply about an argument between relatives. Before we go any further, make sure you subscribe so you never miss another royal investigation. The confrontation between Laura Lopes and Princess Anne lasted only moments, but inside that crowded hall, something changed almost immediately. Nothing suggested that the afternoon was about to become a family confrontation witnessed by guests and members of the press. Then Laura appeared. She approached Anne directly and, according to accounts surrounding the incident, challenged her over decisions affecting Camilla's family. The tone was sharp enough to attract attention almost instantly. Conversations around them began to fade. People turned. Reporters started watching more closely, and Anne did something that made the moment even more uncomfortable. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She did not attempt to defend herself against the accusations being made in public. Instead, she remained almost completely still. For a moment, Anne simply adjusted her gloves and allowed the silence around her to grow. Then she reportedly turned the situation into a question of protocol, asking why Laura had been permitted into that particular area in the first place. It was a remarkably controlled response. But there was another detail that made the confrontation far more troubling. A photographer was already positioned nearby. The camera was pointed toward Anne before the exchange had fully escalated, and the sound of the shutter could be heard as the confrontation unfolded. That detail immediately changed the character of the incident. A spontaneous family argument is one thing. A family argument taking place directly in front of a camera is something else. And if that photographer had genuinely been there before anyone knew an argument was coming, then the obvious question was impossible to avoid. Who knew? Laura continued pressing the accusation. The atmosphere inside the hall became increasingly uncomfortable as guests realized they were watching something that was never supposed to happen during a formal royal engagement. Anne still refused to give her the confrontation she appeared to be seeking. Eventually, security intervened. Laura was asked to leave the immediate area, bringing the public confrontation to an end. The entire episode was brief, but its effect was anything but brief, because once the room returned to normal, attention shifted away from what Laura had said and towards something much more important. How had she entered? Royal events are built around controlled access. Guest lists are checked. Movements are monitored. Security arrangements exist precisely to prevent unexpected confrontations involving senior members of the royal family. Yet Laura had somehow reached Anne. That meant somebody had either failed to follow the established procedure or somebody had made an exception. And the palace could not afford to ignore either possibility. As staff began examining the access arrangements, another question started to emerge. Was Laura simply angry enough to confront Anne publicly? Or had someone helped create the circumstances that made the confrontation possible? That was the question that would eventually reach Prince William. And when William finally saw the footage for himself, he was not interested in a polite summary of what had happened. He wanted the original recording because what he saw on that footage would force him to look beyond the argument itself and start asking who had opened the door for it to happen. By the time Princess Anne left the event, the confrontation itself was already becoming yesterday's story inside the palace. What mattered now was who had allowed it to happen. Anne did not appear interested in revenge. She did not call reporters. She did not publicly criticize Laura Lopes. Instead, she focused on the access failure, treating the incident as a breach of protocol rather than a personal insult. That distinction was important. because for Anne, the problem was never simply what had been said to her. The more serious issue was that someone had managed to bring an unexpected confrontation directly into her working environment, and that raised uncomfortable questions about trust. Anne had spent decades operating within an institution where every movement, invitation, and official appearance was carefully coordinated. She understood that protocol was not merely ceremony. It was a system designed to protect the people inside it. If that system could be bypassed once, it could be bypassed again. Meanwhile, Laura was experiencing the same event from an entirely different perspective. To her, this was not simply an attack on Princess Anne. It was the latest expression of a resentment that had apparently been building around her family for some time. Changes affecting Camilla's household had become increasingly difficult for those close to her family to ignore. Budgets were being reviewed, administrative responsibilities were shifting, access that had once seemed natural was becoming more restricted. For Laura, those changes could easily have felt personal. She believed she was defending her mother. But there was a problem. The public confrontation had created consequences that went far beyond the grievance she wanted to express. And then there was Camilla herself. She had not been present during the confrontation, at least publicly. Her official movements placed her elsewhere, which meant there was no immediate evidence that she had known what Laura intended to do. That uncertainty became one of the most important emotional questions surrounding the entire incident. Did Camilla know her daughter was going to confront Anne? Did she approve of it? Or had Laura acted completely on her own? Nobody inside the palace seemed prepared to answer those questions. Then William became involved. When the footage reached him, he reportedly did not want a briefing designed to summarize the incident. He wanted to see what had actually happened. That choice revealed something about his state of mind. He was not simply trying to understand why two members of his extended family had argued. He wanted to know exactly how the confrontation had unfolded, who had been present, and what had happened immediately before it began. The footage showed Anne remaining remarkably composed. It showed Laura moving toward her. It showed the reaction of the people around them. And it showed the photographer. That image stayed with William. Because if the confrontation had been spontaneous, the photographer's position might have been nothing more than coincidence. But if someone had known the confrontation was coming, then the entire incident needed to be viewed differently. William now had a choice. He could treat the episode as another uncomfortable family dispute and allow everyone to move on. Or he could investigate the circumstances that had made it possible. And once he began asking questions, the issue became much larger than Laura. The first thing his team needed to establish was simple. Who had authorized her access to the event? Because somewhere in the answer was the first indication that this confrontation may have begun long before anyone inside that hall realized it. The answer began with the guest list. According to the information surrounding the incident, Laura Lopes had not been expected to occupy that particular area of the event. Her presence therefore raised a question that was much more difficult than simply asking why she had confronted Princess Anne. Someone had allowed her through. Staff began reviewing the access arrangements, and the name of a regional official reportedly appeared in connection with the last-minute change. That detail mattered because royal access is rarely casual. An invitation can determine where someone stands, which rooms they can enter, who they can approach, and how closely security monitors their movements. A seemingly minor administrative decision can therefore create consequences far beyond the person whose name appears on a list. And now that decision had placed Laura directly in front of Anne. The palace response was reportedly swift. The official involved faced scrutiny over how the access had been approved, while staff began examining whether normal procedures had been bypassed. But William's team was looking at something else. Why had Laura wanted to confront Anne in the first place? The dispute appeared to involve changes affecting Camilla's wider family and the management of royal resources. From Laura's perspective, those changes may have looked like a deliberate attempt to push her family further away from the institution. That gave her a motive for anger, but it did not explain the camera. The photographer remained the most uncomfortable piece of the puzzle. He had been in position before the confrontation became public. His lens had a clear view of Anne, and the resulting footage captured precisely the kind of dramatic royal moment that media organizations could value enormously. That did not prove the confrontation had been arranged, but it made coincidence increasingly difficult to ignore. William therefore wanted to know who had known about Laura's arrival. Who had known where Anne would be standing? Who had known when the room would be crowded enough for a confrontation to attract attention? And most importantly, who had known that a photographer would be there? Those questions transformed the story. Until this point, Laura could be viewed as an angry daughter defending her mother. Anne could be viewed as a senior royal enforcing boundaries. William could simply be another family member reacting to an embarrassing incident. But the access records introduced another possibility. Perhaps the confrontation had been encouraged. Perhaps someone had wanted Laura to make her grievance public. Or perhaps Laura had acted independently, while other people simply recognized an opportunity and prepared to record the result. The distinction was crucial, because if the photographer had merely been lucky, the story remained a family dispute. If someone had deliberately created the conditions for the photograph, then the argument was only the visible part of something much larger. William understood that, and rather than immediately accusing anyone, he began looking for evidence. He wanted names. He wanted records. He wanted to know who had requested the access change and who had approved it. Then, another detail surfaced. The official who had facilitated Laura's entry was not simply a random employee. There appeared to be a connection between him and people within Camilla's wider circle. Suddenly, the door that had allowed Laura inside looked less like an administrative mistake. It looked like the beginning of a trail. But where that trail ultimately led was something William had not yet discovered. And the next piece of evidence would force him to ask a far more dangerous question. Had someone inside the royal system been helping create the conflict from the beginning? William did not want another explanation. He wanted the footage. That distinction would become important because summaries can be softened, edited, or shaped by the person delivering them. Raw footage cannot easily hide the silence between words, the reactions of people in the room, or the precise moment when a seemingly ordinary encounter turns into something else. William reportedly watched the recording without interruption. There was Anne, standing completely composed. There was Laura, moving closer and challenging her. There were guests beginning to notice. And there was the camera, already positioned to capture the confrontation. When the footage ended, William's attention reportedly shifted away from Laura herself. He wanted to know who had allowed her access. A private meeting followed. Senior staff were asked to explain how someone who was not expected to be in that particular area had reached one of the most senior members of the royal family during an official engagement. The first explanation was administrative. An invitation had been approved through a regional channel, but William was not satisfied. Who had requested it? Who had authorized it? And why had the relevant security information not followed the guest? The room reportedly became uncomfortable when those questions were asked. Nobody wanted to be responsible for an apparent failure that had placed Anne in an unpredictable confrontation. But William was looking beyond individual responsibility. For him, the incident suggested something more troubling. The possibility that informal relationships were beginning to interfere with the formal chain of command. That was a dangerous distinction. A royal household can survive disagreement. It cannot function if different parts of the institution begin following different sources of authority. William therefore began examining the people connected to the access decision. The regional official who had facilitated Laura's entry became particularly important. His professional position gave him access to procedures, but his connections outside the formal hierarchy raised new questions. Was he acting independently? Had somebody pressured him? Or had he simply made a favor for someone he knew? William then turned to the photographer. The existence of the footage was no longer being treated as an interesting coincidence. His team wanted to know how the photographer had obtained access, who had commissioned the work, and whether anyone had communicated with him before the confrontation. No accusation was necessary yet. The questions themselves were enough. Then William contacted his father. The conversation between William and King Charles was reportedly restrained, but the disagreement beneath it was much deeper. William's concern was institutional. Charles was facing something more personal. Any investigation into Camilla's wider circle would inevitably touch people connected to his wife. Moving too aggressively could turn a difficult family dispute into a permanent fracture. William's position was different. He believed that allowing personal relationships to influence official procedures would create an even greater problem later. The king listened. William explained what had been discovered so far. and asked for authority to continue examining the circumstances surrounding the confrontation. Charles did not immediately make the situation public, but he gave his son room to investigate. That quiet decision changed the balance inside the palace. William now had permission to look beyond the confrontation itself, and once his team began examining the wider network around the access decision, they encountered something neither the guest list nor the original footage could explain. There appeared to be financial connections surrounding people involved in the incident. At first, they looked insignificant. Then the numbers began to add up, and what William was about to discover would change the story completely. Because the question was no longer simply who opened the door. It was who might have had something to gain from what happened after that door opened. The financial records changed the entire meaning of the confrontation. Until this point, there had been several possible explanations. Laura could have acted out of anger. The regional official could have made a reckless decision. The photographer could simply have been in the right place at the right time. But the investigation was beginning to suggest that these events might have been connected. William's team reportedly began examining the people involved in Laura's access, starting with the regional official who had facilitated her arrival. What they found was not immediately dramatic. There were payments, there were connections, there were transactions that, on their own, might have had perfectly innocent explanations, but when investigators placed them alongside the timing of the confrontation, the pattern became harder to dismiss. The official had allegedly received unexplained payments that eventually amounted to around £100,000. That was the moment the investigation changed direction. Because a person might risk their career to help someone they know. They might even make a foolish decision because of personal loyalty. But a substantial, unexplained payment creates an entirely different question. Who was paying him? And what were they paying for? The photographer suddenly became more important. If the confrontation had generated valuable footage, then the existence of a camera at precisely the right moment was no longer a minor detail. Investigators began examining whether the media organization involved had been expecting exclusive material. The possibility was deeply uncomfortable. A royal confrontation is valuable because it is rare. A confrontation involving Princess Anne, a member of Camilla's family, and a visibly tense crowd could become even more valuable. But none of this proved that Laura herself had been part of a deliberate plan. That distinction mattered. She may genuinely have believed she was defending her mother. She may have entered the event angry, confronted Anne, and only later discovered that other people were benefiting from the spectacle. If that was true, then Laura was not necessarily the architect of the situation. She may have been the person placed in front of the camera, and that possibility made the story more disturbing, because someone can manipulate a family conflict without controlling the people inside it. William reportedly understood that the moment he was briefed about the financial trail, his concern was no longer simply protecting Anne from another confrontation. It was protecting the institution from people who might be willing to exploit family tensions for money or influence. The question now became much larger. Had someone deliberately engineered a public confrontation because they believed the resulting scandal could weaken the palace's authority? And if money had changed hands, who had provided it? The answer would matter more than the argument itself, because if the confrontation had been purchased, then Laura's words were only the visible part of the operation. The real story was hidden behind the people who had created the circumstances around her. William, therefore, ordered the investigation to continue. Access records were reviewed. Financial links were examined. Media contacts were scrutinized. And the regional officials' professional relationships were placed under a much brighter light. For the first time, William was no longer dealing with an embarrassing family incident. He was dealing with a potential institutional threat, but there was still one problem. Financial evidence could explain who benefited. It could not yet explain who wanted the confrontation to happen. And that unanswered question was about to force William into the most consequential decision of the entire story. Because the palace machinery was already beginning to move, the palace could no longer treat the confrontation as an isolated family dispute. William had seen enough to believe that the problem reached beyond the argument between Laura and Anne. Now, the institution had to respond, and the response was not dramatic in the way the public might have expected. There was no furious announcement, no public accusation. Instead, the machinery began moving quietly. Access arrangements were reviewed. Regional appointments came under scrutiny. Staff connections were examined. Security procedures were tightened. People who had once moved comfortably between different parts of the royal household suddenly found themselves facing new restrictions. That was how institutional power worked. It rarely arrived with a speech. It arrived through paperwork, a revised procedure, a new approval requirement, a meeting that suddenly required permission, a person who was no longer included in the room. For Camilla's wider family, those changes began to feel increasingly personal. People who had once enjoyed easy access to royal circles were now being treated more cautiously. Administrative relationships that had existed for years were being questioned. Financial arrangements connected to estate activities were reportedly being examined more closely, and William was becoming increasingly determined that the boundaries should remain clear. His position was straightforward. The monarchy could not operate effectively if personal relationships allowed people to bypass official authority. Anne's confrontation had therefore become a symbol of something larger. It represented a test of whether the institution still controlled its own doors. For Princess Anne, that principle appeared to matter more than personal resentment. She reportedly continued with her duties without publicly discussing Laura. Her silence was powerful. She did not need to attack anyone. The institution was already responding. Meanwhile, Charles faced a much more painful reality. Every administrative measure affecting Camilla's family also affected his wife. The king was therefore caught between two competing responsibilities. As a husband, he could understand why Camilla's family might feel abandoned. As monarch, he had to consider what would happen if the palace appeared unwilling to enforce its own rules. William's approach was increasingly difficult to reverse. He was not simply asking for an apology. He wanted structural changes. He wanted stronger control over access. He wanted clearer separation between official royal business and private family interests. And he wanted the financial questions answered before anyone could argue that the entire affair had been exaggerated. Inside the palace, the atmosphere reportedly became colder. People began choosing their words more carefully. Staff who had previously maintained relationships across different households became aware that those relationships could now attract attention. The message was simple. The old informal arrangements were being reconsidered. But there was still a personal dimension that William could not ignore. Princess Anne had been the person publicly confronted. She had absorbed the humiliation without giving the confrontation more oxygen. William, however, had seen something different in the footage. He had seen a senior member of his family placed in an unpredictable situation while a camera recorded every second. For him, that was not merely disrespect. It was a warning, and the institution was responding to that warning. The consequences were beginning to spread beyond one event, one guest list, and one regional official. But William knew that administrative changes alone would not settle the matter. There was still one person who had to make the final choice. His father, because sooner or later Charles would have to decide whether protecting the old family arrangement was worth the risk of preserving it. And once that decision reached the private rooms of the palace, there would be no easy way back. The final conversation between William and Charles was never going to be easy. By this point, the palace had already begun changing the rules around access, staff relationships, and the management of royal affairs. The machinery was moving, but the most important decision still belonged to the king. Charles had to decide whether the old understanding of family loyalty could survive what had happened. William entered the conversation without asking his father to punish Camilla. That distinction mattered. His argument was about the institution. He believed the monarchy could not function properly if private relationships were allowed to influence official procedures. The confrontation involving Anne had shown him how quickly personal resentment could become a public embarrassment, and the financial questions surrounding the incident had made the situation even harder to dismiss. William wanted boundaries, clear ones. No informal channels, no unexplained access, no private family network operating alongside the official structure. Charles listened. For the king, however, the issue could never be entirely administrative. Camilla was his wife. Any decision affecting her family would inevitably affect her personally. And Charles had spent years trying to create a workable relationship between different parts of his family, even when that relationship was uncomfortable. Now his son was effectively telling him that compromise had reached its limit. There was silence in the room. William did not need to raise his voice. The evidence, at least from his perspective, had already made the argument for him. The access irregularities, the unexplained financial trail, the photographer, the growing questions about who had influenced whom. Each detail made the possibility of simply moving on more difficult. Charles reportedly understood what William was saying, but understanding it did not make the decision painless. The king faced two competing forms of responsibility. One was personal, the other belonged to the crown. William's fear was that if the palace softened its response because the people involved were connected to Camilla, then the institution would be sending a message that rules depended on relationships. Charles knew exactly why his son felt that way, but he also knew what would happen if he agreed. The consequences would not remain inside a briefing room. They would reach Camilla, they would reach Laura, they would reach the wider family. And once those boundaries were formally established, rebuilding trust could become almost impossible. William remained firm. He did not ask his father to humiliate anyone publicly. He wanted the institutional separation to be formal, unmistakable, and permanent. Charles finally accepted the principle. The decision was made quietly. No cameras, no reporters, no dramatic announcement. Just a private understanding between a father and his son that the old arrangement could no longer continue unchanged. But William knew that the most difficult part was still ahead, because a decision made behind palace doors can remain invisible for only so long. Eventually, people notice who is no longer invited. They notice who is no longer standing beside whom. They notice which offices have changed hands. And they notice when a familiar face suddenly disappears from the royal circle. The palace had made its choice. Now the public was about to see the consequences, and when the story finally escaped the palace walls, the argument would no longer belong only to the people involved. It would belong to everyone watching. The story could no longer be contained inside the palace. What had begun as a confrontation involving Laura Lopes and Princess Anne was now becoming a national conversation about access, influence, family loyalty, and the boundaries of royal power. The footage spread quickly. People who had never heard about the original dispute were suddenly watching the same few moments from different angles, searching for expressions, gestures, and reactions that might explain what had really happened. Anne's silence became part of the story. Laura's confrontation became another part, and William's reported response became the question everyone wanted answered. Why had he reacted so strongly? The media offered competing interpretations. Some portrayed Laura as a daughter defending her mother after months of frustration. Others saw the confrontation as a serious breach of royal protocol. There were also questions about the photographer and the circumstances surrounding the recording. How had the photographer been there? Who had arranged the access? And why had the confrontation produced exactly the kind of footage that could dominate the news cycle? Then the financial allegations began to attract attention. The reported payments connected to the regional official changed the conversation again. This was no longer simply about whether Laura had behaved appropriately. If money had influenced access to the event, then the public was looking at a completely different kind of problem. The focus shifted toward documents, financial relationships, and possible connections between people who were never supposed to be connected in the first place. That shift also created a new problem for the palace. Silence had once been the safest response. Now, silence looked suspicious. Every hour without an explanation gave commentators more space to create their own version of events. Television analysts debated the meaning of Anne's reaction. Royal correspondents examined the guest list. Financial journalists began looking at the alleged money trail. Online audiences dissected the footage frame by frame. The original confrontation had lasted only moments. The public discussion surrounding it seemed almost impossible to stop. Inside the palace, communications officials faced a difficult choice. They could issue a carefully worded statement and risk appearing evasive. Or they could provide more information and risk exposing details that had previously remained private. William's approach reportedly favored documentation. Instead of turning the situation into a personal attack, the emerging strategy was to focus attention on procedures and evidence. The message was simple. This was not about one person's feelings. It was about whether the institution had been manipulated. That distinction changed public perception. A family argument can attract sympathy. An alleged attempt to manipulate access to a senior royal is much harder to dismiss. And once financial questions entered the discussion, the story became even more serious. Laura's position also became more complicated. Whatever her original motivation, She was now at the center of a controversy much larger than the confrontation she had initiated. People who had previously viewed her simply as Camilla's daughter were now asking whether she had understood the wider circumstances surrounding the event. The palace, meanwhile, was trying to regain control of a narrative it had allowed to grow in silence. But public attention had already moved beyond the original argument. The question was no longer simply who was right. It was whether the royal household had been forced to confront a problem that had been developing quietly for much longer than anyone outside the palace realized. And then came the moment when nobody needed to explain the answer. The next major royal appearance would reveal everything through absence, distance, body language, and the people who suddenly stood where others once had. The palace was about to speak without saying a word. The most revealing moment came without an argument. There was no raised voice, no accusation, and no dramatic announcement. There was simply a public royal appearance, and the people watching closely began to notice what had changed. The event followed the familiar choreography of royal life. Members of the family arrived. Officials took their positions. Photographers gathered in front of them. Everyone knew where they were expected to stand. And yet the arrangement looked different. Anne remained exactly where she had always been expected to be, composed, focused, and apparently unaffected by the controversy that had surrounded her. William appeared equally controlled. There was no visible anger now, no sign that he needed to explain himself. His posture communicated something much quieter: authority. The most important details, however, were not the people who were present. They were the people who were missing. A familiar presence connected to Camilla's wider family was no longer visible in the same way. There was no obvious confrontation, no announcement explaining the absence, but the distance itself became meaningful. Royal audiences are accustomed to reading symbolism through small details: who arrives beside whom, who receives a greeting, who stands behind the principal figures, who walks together, who remains separated. At an ordinary family event, these details might mean almost nothing. Inside a monarchy, they can communicate an entire institutional decision without anyone saying a word. Anne's behavior was particularly striking because she did not appear to acknowledge the controversy at all. She continued performing her role. That was perhaps the strongest statement she could have made. She did not look triumphant. She did not seek public sympathy. She simply carried on. William, meanwhile, appeared to have moved beyond the anger that had defined the earlier stages of the story. The fury had become something more controlled. The decision had been made. The boundaries had been established, and now he was allowing the institution to speak through its normal procedures. For Charles, the symbolism was more complicated. He remained at the center of the monarchy while knowing that the decisions made behind closed doors had changed his personal family relationships. A king can sign a document, he can approve a procedure, he can authorize a restructuring, but none of those actions can erase the emotional consequences. That was visible in the careful distance surrounding the royal family. The public could see the institution functioning. What they could not see was the private cost of making it function. And then there was Camilla. Her absence, or her changed position within the royal circle, became one of the most powerful images of the entire story. No statement was required. No one needed to explain what had happened. The contrast was enough. Once family connections had appeared to place people close to the center of royal life, now those same connections seemed to have become a reason for greater distance. The photograph told a story that words could not easily control. Anne was still standing. William was still carrying out his role. Charles was still king. The institution was still functioning. But something inside the family had clearly changed. And perhaps that was the real victory William had been seeking. Not humiliation, not revenge. Control. The ability to ensure that the rules of the institution remained stronger than the relationships surrounding it. Yet as the cameras moved away and the public appearance ended, another question remained. If the crown had restored its authority, what had it sacrificed to do so? Because the final cost of this confrontation would not appear in an access log, a financial record, or an official statement. It would be measured in relationships, and that was where the story was finally heading. The confrontation was over, but its consequences were only beginning to settle into the lives of everyone involved. For William, the episode had become a defining test of what kind of future monarch he intended to be. He had chosen institutional authority over personal accommodation, believing that the crown could not survive if private relationships were allowed to determine how its rules were applied. But victories inside a family rarely feel like victories. Anne emerged from the controversy almost exactly as she had entered it, controlled, disciplined, and unwilling to turn a private grievance into a public performance. She had not demanded sympathy. She had not publicly attacked Laura. Her response was simply to continue working. That silence may ultimately have been her strongest statement. For Laura, the consequences were far more personal. What began as an attempt to defend her mother had placed her family under a level of scrutiny they could never have anticipated. Whatever her original intentions, the confrontation became inseparable from the wider questions surrounding access, influence, and financial relationships. And Camilla was left facing perhaps the most painful position of all. Her family had been pushed away from the institution she had spent years becoming part of. The king could protect the crown. William could restructure the system. Anne could return to her duties. But Camilla could not simply erase what had happened between her husband, her family, and the institution surrounding them. That is the paradox at the heart of the entire story. The monarchy may have protected its boundaries, but boundaries have consequences. Every rule that was strengthened created a distance that could not easily be undone. Every office reassigned represented a relationship that had changed. Every invitation that disappeared became another reminder that access to the royal world was never guaranteed. And Charles was left between two identities. He was the king responsible for protecting the institution, but he was also a husband and father watching the consequences unfold inside his own family. Perhaps that is why the final silence mattered more than any statement. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no emotional speech, no convenient ending in which everyone suddenly understood one another. Instead, the royal household continued. Engagements continued. Duties continued. The machinery of monarchy continued moving forward. That may be the most revealing part of all. Institutions survive by continuing even when individuals are hurting. William may have believed that he had restored order. Anne may have believed that the principle mattered more than the confrontation. Camilla may have understood that some doors, once closed, do not reopen simply because the people behind them are family. And Charles had to live with the knowledge that preserving the crown sometimes means accepting consequences that no private conversation can repair. The original confrontation lasted only moments. Its meaning lasted far longer, because what happened that day was never really just about Laura, Anne, or William. It was about where personal loyalty ends and institutional duty begins. And once that boundary was finally drawn, everyone in the family had to decide which side of it they could live with. In the end, the palace remained standing. The rules remained intact. The public saw an institution apparently restored to order, but behind those walls, something much more fragile had been lost. The crown had protected itself. The family had paid the price. And perhaps the quietest lesson of all was this: in a royal family, the most painful decisions are not always the ones that destroy the institution. Sometimes they are the ones that save it.